Well, hi everybody. Bill Prince here, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes with you talking about some of the material in Chapter 1 of our textbook. As I indicated to you in emails and so forth, and the announcement page, I will not be able to be present in class this first week beginning after Wednesday. So Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, unfortunately, I'm out of town, and we will be getting back to it first thing on Monday. But rather than leave you hanging out there, I thought we would put up some material and some assignments and sort of have you get cracking at it. So, again, make sure that you check Canvas for the assignments that are scheduled these first couple of days, and there'll be a couple more mentioned during the course of this particular lecture that you'll need to do as well, which will get you some points and indicate to me that you've actually watched the lecture. So we are going to spend some time talking, obviously, in this class about American government and politics. And the way that the class is laid out, it's in three basic sections. Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 talk about the nature of government in general, and then spend some time talking specifically in chapters 2 and 3 about how we came to have the constitutional republic form of government that we have in the United States of America. Chapters 4 and 5 then talk about the Constitution and our civil liberties, which are limitations upon what the government can do to us, and civil rights, which limits the ability of the government to treat people differently based upon the color of their skin, their religious orientation, their sexual orientation, things of that nature. So that's the first part. Then chapters 6, 7, and 8 talk about politics, the process by which elections are run and won. We'll talk about political parties. We'll talk about special interest groups. We'll talk about the role of the media in politics. We'll talk about political socialization. How do we form the political beliefs that we end up having? You know, everybody that's in class is here kind of at a different place, and some of us are conservatives, and some of us are liberals, and some of us are sort of depends kind of people. Some of us don't have any interest in politics at all, and again, it's no accident how we got to be in those particular positions, and so we'll spend some time talking about how we came to be socialized in the way that we have. Then chapters 9 through 14 will talk about the different pieces of our government. We'll talk about the legislative branch, we'll talk about the executive branch, we'll talk about the judicial branch, and then we'll spend some time talking about domestic and foreign policy. So that's kind of a broad macro sort of 30,000 feet view of the class. And so in the first section, we're going to sort of talk about why we have government to begin with, and specifically why do we have the government that we have in this country. All right, well, now the first thing that I want you to do as part of watching this video and then the assignment that goes along with it is I want you just to sort of do a free association, and I want you to think about 10 ways that the government impacts you on a daily basis. Think from the minute that you get up in the morning until the time that you go to bed at night, and everything that you do in between. How is it that government impacts you? And that can be the federal government, the state government, the city government, the county government, whatever governments come into play in our lives. I want you to think about, and then I want you to go to the assignment that's listed under the Canvas date, and list there for me the 10 ways that government impacts your life. So you'll see that question there, and then you'll see a second question which will ask you what is the code for this particular lecture. So what I do sometimes to ensure that folks are watching these lectures is that I will put a code. It'll be a 4-number code. that I will kind of give you one number a little bit throughout the course of the lecture, and it'll end up in a 4-digit number, and then you just need to write that down, and you'll get points, and I'll know that you've watched the lecture. So the first number is 1. Okay, there'll be 3 more coming throughout the lectures, but the first number is 1. So anyway, what I want you to do is I want you to spend a few minutes free associating how government impacts your life. And, just some examples: speed limits, highway safety, clothing labels, mattress labels, that kind of thing. And then write those down for me. All right. Well, one thing we need to do is we need to define what is government and what is politics. And government is, I like to think of as a noun. If we were in an English class, government would be a noun. It's a thing. A government is an institution which is created to carry out certain functions. And again, whenever we talk about institutions, be it the institution of government, the institution of education, the institution of the church, the institution of the family, these are all things that are created with a goal in mind to carry out a particular function. And so what we need to figure out is, what is the function of government? And the basic function of government is to have a vehicle in which politics can be played out. And so that brings us to the second question, and that is, what are politics? Now, politics, again, if we were in an English class, would be a verb, an action word. And what politics it's the process by which we decide who gets what and how much. Okay? Politics, as we all know, is not just limited to government. Anytime that we have 2 or more people together, there is always the room for politics. Think about your family, if you have brothers or sisters, and think about the politics that you play there in order to get mom or dad, to do this thing or the other thing. Think about the workplace that you may be working in, the politics there, working with the boss or the co-workers and things of that nature. And so politics is the process by which, again, we sort of decide who gets what and how much. And again, when we're talking about government and politics, we're talking about really dealing with a finite number of resources, and politics is the process by which we divide those resources up. So we'll talk more about examples of those as we go along. All right, well, why is government necessary? Well, as you can see on the slide here with Mr. Cartman from South Park, the primary reason why governments exist is because they provide order. We think about, oh gosh, I just wish that, I could do my own thing. I just wish I didn't have all these rules that I had to follow. Be that in the family, be that in the workplace, be that in our society. But again, the reason why governments come into being in the first place is because they provide us with order and protection. We're going to spend a little bit of time later talking about a guy by the name of Thomas Hobbes, who was an English philosopher. And Thomas Hobbes talked about this idea that, without rules or without order, our lives would be like the lives of the animals, which would be solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short. So if you think about it, and we're going to go back to this slide right there, that's a picture of a still from a movie called Mad Max Fury Road. And again, if you've ever watched any of the Mad Max movies, this is the most recent of them, you know that Mad Max, takes place in sort of this dystopian future where there's been some sort of, civilization shattering event, whether it was an atomic war or some sort of disease or pestilence, who knows. But basically, at the end of it stripped all order from society. And we see who sort of fills into that void when order doesn't exist, and it's the meanest, the most ruthless, the most vicious people who tend to take power, and they prey on the weak and the slow and those who are not as strong as they are. And so, in the absence of order, we have anarchy, and when we have anarchy, we have these sorts of groups fill in. So, order, while we don't like rules, is important because, again, it provides us with civilization. And so that's why government exists, is to provide order. Now, that order can be meted out in a democratic fashion, such as we have in this country, or if you look at other examples across the world and across history of governments, some of those governments provide order through fear, intimidation, and at the force of the gun. But the primary reason is to provide some sort of structure and order to an otherwise unorganized society. All right, so when we start talking about the purpose of government providing order, though, that does create a couple of natural conflicts. And these natural conflicts will be themes that will play out throughout many of our discussions during the rest of this course. The first of those conflicts or dilemmas is what's known as order versus freedom. And here's where that comes into play. Assuming that government comes into place to provide order, keep in mind that when there are rules, people have to obey those rules. And when people have to obey those rules, that has an effect of impinging upon their freedom. So think about this. If you're a motorcycle rider, there is a law in some states that says you have to have a helmet on. All right. Now, two questions there. First of all, is it the role of government to protect ourselves from ourselves? But we'll talk about that issue later. But in passing that law, the motorcycle rider has been told that you have to wear this helmet. So that sort of impinges upon that individual's freedom. So the more order that we have in a society, the less individual freedom exists in a society. And we will find that our country, along with other governments, has been struggling to find the appropriate balance between order and freedom for a long time, and I suspect that will be one that will be with us for a long time. The second conflict that exists when we have government is this issue of freedom versus equality. Some governments, like ours, put a kind of an emphasis on making sure that we treat citizens of our country as equally as possible. And when we start requiring equality of treatment for people, that can impinge upon the freedom of other people to treat people unequally. So when we talk about having affirmative action laws, when we talk about having laws that prevent discrimination based on gender, based on sexual orientation, based on religious ethnicity, those sorts of things, we see that there's a natural conflict between the freedom to behave in the way we want to behave and treat people the way we want to treat people versus the government telling us how people need to be treated. So those are going to be a couple of dilemmas or conflicts that we're going to study throughout the course. Now, for there to be government to exist or to have order, there has to be these two things. There has to be legitimacy and there has to be authority. Okay. What does that mean? Well, in other words, why do the people put up with the rulers? Why do people listen to kings? Why do people listen to presidents? Why do people listen to dictators? Well, they do that because governments have legitimacy and authority. So when we talk about legitimacy, we're talking about the ability of a government or a governing body to say, we are rightfully here. We have the credentials to rule. So think about kings and queens and princesses and princes. Think of Game of Thrones. Think of any program that you've ever watched where monarchies are involved. Much of the drama that goes on there is who has the legitimacy to rule the realm. And again, if you think about kings and queens and stuff like that, their legitimacy comes from bloodline. Who is the natural heir to the throne. And again, that bloodline usually stems from somebody who claims to have received divine authority or something of that nature. But they claim to rule because of who their ancestors were. That's one form of legitimacy. In our country, legitimacy is based on the idea of free and fair elections. And again, if the people believe that the election was somehow compromised, was somehow corrupted, then that may cast doubt on their belief that the individual is rightfully in power. And again, you don't have to look too far back in the history books to see, even in our democracy, where we've had legitimacy issues thrown into the public arena. The first of those in the most recent history would have been back in 2000 when Al Gore was defeated by George W. Bush in the presidential election. And if you recall, George W. Bush, while receiving the majority of the Electoral College votes, did not receive the majority of the popular vote. So more people voted for Gore than Bush, but Bush won because of the Electoral College. And then you might remember that there was a controversy in Florida, one of those crucial states, and if you recall, the Supreme Court got involved and stopped the recount and things of that nature. And so for 8 years, George W. Bush sort of lived under this cloud that his presidency was somehow illegitimate. Then look in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president. And again, for a number of years, there were people, the birthers, who claimed that he was not a U.S. citizen and therefore casting doubt on the legitimacy of him to serve as president. And then just look in the newspapers today, and we're seeing about the Soviet Union or Russia hacking our election system or hacking emails in order to potentially favor one candidate versus another. These are all efforts to undermine the legitimacy of free and fair elections or the legitimacy of the individual who's holding the office. And again, without legitimacy, it's very difficult to maintain order in government. The second thing that there has to have order for a government to work is authority, or as Mr. Cartman says, authority. And authority is basically, you do what I say to do because. Now, in some governments, dictatorships, totalitarian regimes, that authority comes at the end of a gun. If you don't like what I'm doing, I'll shoot you, or I'll shoot your family, or I'll make you disappear. Threat, intimidation, and things of that nature. In our country, our government exists because of the consent of the people. So we give the government the authority to rule us, and we'll talk about the limitations on that as we go along. But for purposes of this, understand that legitimacy and authority are crucial to have a functioning government. Okay, the second code number is 7. So far we have 1, 7. All right. Throughout history, there have been a number of types of governments that have existed in the world. And again, you'll just need to know the definitions of these, and we'll make some comparisons about democracy and Republican democracy with these as we go along. But know and understand what a totalitarian regime is. Now, a totalitarian regime is a situation where the government exercises, usually by force, full control over virtually every aspect of people's lives. So that would include economic issues, social issues, political issues, religious issues. And again, the legitimacy and authority usually comes from force in a totalitarian regime. Think of Stalin in the Soviet Union, governing by fear. The second kind of government that exists is what's known as authoritarianism. And in authoritarianism, that is sort of like totalitarianism light. The government is not quite as involved in social and economic issues, but it still governs very usually brutally by force, and again, not a lot of free will exercised there. Excuse me, I'm getting a froggy throat. The third kind of government that you need to be aware of is what's known as an aristocracy. And, think of the Greeks, think of citizen kings. And aristocracy is government by the best. Okay? In other words, it's this idea that the government should be run by the smartest and brightest people in the world, or in that particular civilization, who will then do things based on their intelligence that will be good for the best of the people. So it's not, the idea that any Tom, Dick, or Harry can be president or ruler, but it's government by the best and the smartest people is what an aristocracy is. Then there is theocracy, and theocracy, think of some of the Middle Eastern countries, is basically where the political system is and the religious system are fused together, and the country is dominated by religious law. Then there's what's known as oligarchy. Oligarchies are governments that are run by a few. So in other words, you would have just a few very powerful, usually wealthy, socially connected people who are in charge of the government. And then there's anarchy, and anarchy is really absence of government or absence of rules. And of course, in an anarchy, there are no rules, is no order. And again, anarchies don't usually stick around too long. Usually, as the old saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. And in that particular case, usually something or somebody will step in to fill the void where there is a lack of order. And so that's what an anarchy is lack of order. So if you look at a spectrum, at the far end of control would be totalitarianism. At the other end would be anarchy, which would be no control. All right, the third number is 7. So far you have 177. All right. We're going to finish up with this slide, and then we'll talk about the rest of the chapter when we meet together in class. But the kind of democracy or the kind of government that we're going to talk about mostly in our class is direct democracy or Republican democracy. Okay, and again, think of democracy. It really doesn't fall within that spectrum that we talked about. But what democracy generally is a government where legitimacy of the government comes from sort of free and fair elections, and authority comes from the consent of the people. Now, there's two kinds of democracies that you need to be aware of. There's a direct democracy and there's a Republican democracy. Direct democracy is that kind of democracy that was created by the ancient Greeks. And in that situation, basically every person who was entitled to vote would be able to vote on all issues. So basically the citizenry would gather at the amphitheater. They would have they'd have white and black stones that they would cast their votes with. White for yes, black for no. And they would vote on everything from building aquifers to going to war with other states to taxes on wines and figs and all that sort of thing. So that is purely a one-man, one-vote sort of deal where everybody has a say on every issue. Now, obviously, in a country like the United States, where the affairs of state are very complicated, that probably wouldn't work. It probably wouldn't have worked in the 1700s, and it certainly wouldn't work in 2016. So our founding fathers created what was known as a republic or a Republican form of democracy, which is basically where the people consent to the government ruling them, but they elect individuals to cast votes for them. So rather than you and I going to Congress and casting votes on agriculture subsidies and trade acts and things of that nature, we elect representatives and we elect senators to go do that for us. So that is the fundamental difference between a Republican democracy and a direct democracy. And so when you see on the test, what kind of democracy are we? It's a Republican democracy, not a direct democracy. Okay, the third number is 7. So we're now at 177. A couple of other things about Greek democracy. Again, their legislative body was made up of all citizens. Now, that was not everybody who lived there. They had slaves, and women couldn't vote, and things of that nature. But their legislature was made up of all individuals who had the authority to vote. And it created three things that stick with us today, even though we are a republic as opposed to a direct democracy. And those three things are initiatives, referendums, and recalls. Let's start with the latter first. A recall is the idea that a politician who has been elected can be removed from his or her office before the end of their term by basically petition and vote of the people. So again, even though the people in a Republican democracy sort of delegate the power to these elected officials, under recall, we have the ability, if we so desire, to remove somebody from office. And again, that's usually not because they're doing things we disagree with, but again, they've engaged in some sort of illegal activity, immoral activity, or unethical activity. So we have that ability. There's also initiative and referendum. An initiative is the idea that we as citizens, for example, if we believe that marijuana ought to be legalized, in the state of Missouri, not medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana ought to be legalized, and our legislature doesn't. In other words, the people that we elect to go to Jefferson City, won't propose bills dealing with that issue. Then we as citizens have the ability, again, to petition and get enough signatures and put that issue on the ballot so that the people can then vote on whether or not recreational marijuana ought to be legalized. So it's sort of an end around the legislative process. And so that's what an initiative is. And then a referendum is where legislators may be faced with a controversial issue that they really don't want to decide, so they can put that out on the ballot for people to vote on as well. So initiative, referendum, and recall continue to give people a direct hand in democracy, sort of like the Greek system. But again, remember that most of our decisions in government are made by those folks that we elect to serve us, and that's why we are a Republican form of democracy. Alrighty, well, I'll tell you what, we are going to stop there, and we'll take up talking about the dangers of direct democracy when we meet again. And so the last number is 6. So 1776 will be the code number that you will put at the bottom of your assignment. Again, I apologize for being out of town, but we will meet next week. And until then, have a good weekend. And as always, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Take care.